So this is the first week with Avocademy where I started to lose some motivation. And a lot of it was really because there was just a massive amount of work that had to be done this week. And so I finally realized that the honeymoon phase was over. Like the first week, second week, I had a ton of motivation, but this week it was just a lot more difficult. And there was even a couple of times where I thought about just quitting, despite the fact that I just dropped $2,000 on this course. And, historically, had I taken this course 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I might have done that. That was just sort of the trend that I would do if things got hard, is that I would quit. But I recently read a book by Steven Pressfield, The War of Art. And in that book, I have a quote here: "The more important a call or action is to our soul's evolution, the more resistance we will feel toward pursuing that." And I can definitely tell you that I feel a lot of resistance towards doing this bootcamp right now. And so I'm choosing to view it as it's something that I need to do. And so therefore I'm not going to quit. But I will say that this has definitely been a week where motivation has not been high. Now the week didn't really start off that great anyway. So I had quite a few interviews scheduled, and then I had 3 people either no-show or there were technological glitches that made it to where I couldn't even conduct the interview. So I had to scramble to get those 5 interviews, but luckily I was able to make it happen. And the difficult thing that I found with the interviews is that I can only guide it so much, right? Like I have an interview script that had about 15 questions on it, but I was only really able to get through that entire script with maybe 2 people because naturally my thought in my head is I didn't want to just read off a script like a robot. I want it to be somewhat conversational. And so for the other 3 people, I deviated, and if they started talking about a different topic, like let's say they were talking about mindset as it relates to music, then I sort of just went with that and started diving into that instead of just going with the other pre-programmed interview questions that I had. And so for me, I actually liked doing that because it was more challenging to ask the probing questions of, why do you think this certain way? Why do you behave this certain way? Obviously, I'm not asking those specific questions, but just those aren't questions that I'm used to asking. And so you get some really neat responses when you start diving into some of those deeper questions. After the interviews, I progressed to module 3, which is basically where I synthesize all the research that I gathered from the interviews and present them in an elegant way. Now, when I was browsing through the actual assignments that I had to do, it honestly was so overwhelming for me, and it was all very new to me, that I fucked off between Wednesday and Friday. I didn't do anything. And that was a bad decision because it left a lot of work for me for the weekend that I could have easily just made my life a lot more simpler had I just divided it up a little better and did more during the week. So the first thing I had to do was an affinity map. And an affinity map is basically where I make sticky notes of all of the relevant information that the interviewees have given to me through the interview process. And the whole goal is that I'm organizing all of these sticky note patterns into different clusters to hopefully form some sort of similarities between them and draw conclusions from there. The big sticking point I had with the affinity maps is you're supposed to group the sticky notes and then sort of come up with a theme for that group. But I sort of put the cart before the horse, and I was trying to come up with categories and then form sticky notes around those, which made the whole process a lot more difficult. So if you're doing this and want a tip, that really is helpful, is just group like sticky notes together. So if you have a couple people that share a similar problem, just put them together and then come up with categories later on. So once I did the affinity map, which I did using Miro, using digital sticky notes, I then had to create a empathy map. And an empathy map is kind of similar, but you're basically trying to create some sort of visual means to empathize with your target persona. So in this case, it was kind of difficult because the assignment wanted me to essentially make 2, so 1 for each kind of person. And so since my problem was trying to find time to make music with the stresses of life, I decided to make 2 empathy maps, one for more the hobbyist and then one more for the aspiring songwriter. And I picked those just because they were based off of the interview responses that I got. If I had gotten other types of responses, I would probably have 2 other types of personas there. And then once I did the empathy map, then I had to come up with the actual personas. So the persona is the really bite-sized, digestible way where you actually sort of personalize the data gathered from your affinity and empathy maps. And so you're actually giving a name to this person and you're listing out just a brief background, what they're hoping to achieve, their pain points. And you're doing that for 2 of the personality types from your empathy map. So each of those 2 empathy maps that you did will have their given persona. Now the tasks themselves were somewhat straightforward, but I will say it was difficult to group some of the sticky notes together. I wasn't able to even use all the sticky notes that I had just because some of them just didn't correspond with anything that I had. Now, as it stands now, I'm currently behind in the boot camp. There is a timeline that we have that we're supposed to follow roughly, and I'm about 1 to 2 assignments behind, or about 3 days behind where I should be. So I have to play definitely a bit of catch up in the coming week. I had a couple mentoring calls as well this past week, and overall, I found that the mentoring calls have been quite helpful, especially since the bootcamp doesn't give a ton of information when it comes to doing these assignments. It literally just gives the bare minimum needed to do the assignments. So at first I didn't like that, but now I'm starting to appreciate that aspect of it because it just forces me to do it. And then the mentoring sessions is where I can get that clarity if I'm just unsure if I'm doing something correctly or not. And as far as next steps for the upcoming week, I have to play catch up by designing how might we questions. I don't even really know what they are. I think they're basically questions to figure out some potential ways in which you might solve some of these pain points for the personas. And then creating journey maps. Again, I don't really even have an idea of what that is. I assume it's something to do with how someone in this target audience goes from discovering their pain point to finding a solution, but I don't really know, just a hunch. And then I enter the ideation phase, which is where I actually get into the nitty-gritty of trying to design some sort of solution to solve the problem that I posed. And this is probably the one thing that I'm most nervous about because my design skills just aren't that great. I've dabbled with Illustrator in the past, but I can't say I've really used any sort of user interface framework to make my design, guide my design choices. So this will be a little bit of a challenge, I think. But yeah, so far I'm liking Avocademy. It's definitely, they advertise as a learn by doing bootcamp, and I totally agree with that. Like I mentioned before, they have, learning material to learn what you're supposed to do, but it's literally the bare minimum that you need to know. And then it's like, okay, go do this now. And so it's really up to you to schedule the mentoring sessions. And I suggest 2 times a week, just because for me, it just keeps me accountable, because I don't want to show up to a mentoring session and say, oh, I forgot to do the assignment. So that just is helpful for me, but for others, they might want more or less. And if you're interested in learning more about Avocademy, I have a link in the description below. It is an affiliate link, so if you want to help support this channel, then that is a great way to do so. And if you want to save $100 off the Avocademy Bootcamp, you can do so by using the code SAVE100. I believe that is still an active link as of posting this, so hopefully that still works for you. But yes, I'll be sure to post my upcoming updates as I go through this bootcamp. And if there's anything in particular you want me to cover, just let me know in the comments below. All right, I will see you in the next video. Take care.